He survived the battlefield, where bullets passed overhead every day, where comrades fell right beside him. Yet he nearly didn't survive simply because he stopped to pump gas in his own country. Why would a United States Marine awarded medals for saving the lives of his fellow soldiers be placed in handcuffs just for filling up his tank that morning? He was still in uniform, his chest heavy with medals, the words U.S. Marines clearly visible, nothing hidden. A police officer approached and ordered him to raise his hands. Not a greeting, not a welcome home, but suspicion. Is that uniform real? Where are your papers? The questions came fast and cold, as if the years he spent fighting had never existed. He answered properly, briefly, calmly. He said he had just returned from the battlefield and only wanted to go home to see his mother. Then came the most bitter paradox. He was told to produce his identification and at the same time ordered not to reach for anything. He stood still. Survival training kicked in by instinct. No reaction, no argument, nothing that might make the situation worse. In just a few short seconds, the honor of a Marine was placed beneath suspicion because of the color of his skin. And power began to be used in the wrong way. If you believe that true courage does not live in the sound of gunfire, but in the silence of those who have walked through war, subscribe to Brave Veteran Stories so together we can preserve the memory, dignity, and reverence owed to our quiet heroes. He stood still, not out of fear, but because that was what he had been trained to do when a situation slipped beyond the reach of words. During his years on the battlefield, he learned that a single wrong movement could cost a life. So now, in the quiet of a gas station, he chose to stand as he once stood under fire. Not bowing his head, not lifting it in defiance, simply standing in the place of a soldier who had learned to keep discipline even when no one was giving orders. His hand tightened by reflex. One brief beat, then it relaxed. It was a small gesture, but one he had long used to remind himself that he still had control. He had done it in bunkers in darkness amid unending explosions. And now he did it again, in a place that should have been far safer than any battlefield. His uniform was clean, not a hurried wrinkle in sight. The medals were set neatly aligned, worn exactly where they belonged. Not to boast, but because he had been taught that this was how you honored those who no longer had the chance to stand here. Each medal was a name, a face, a voice that had once called out to him through smoke and fire. He had never worn them for himself. No one heard him say anything then. In truth, he didn't need to. He had already spoken enough in the years before, when filing mission reports, when calling for medics, when shouting a comrade's name over gunfire. The words that mattered had all been spoken in places where silence meant death. Here, silence was simply the way to preserve his dignity. In his mind, something very simple appeared. Not heroics, not medals, but his mother's familiar kitchen. The smell of food he had thought about through long nights far away. The moment of stepping through the door, calling out, "I'm home," and seeing her turn around, freeze for a heartbeat, then pull him into her arms. He had been through places no human being should ever have to go. He had done things only a very few are ever asked to do, and all he wanted now was to finish the last stretch of the journey, to come home as a son. He knew this feeling well, the feeling of keeping absolute still inside while everything outside grew loud. He had stood like this while waiting for orders in the dark. He had stood like this while listening to footsteps, unsure whether they belonged to friend or foe. And now he stood the same way again, facing looks of suspicion, not from an enemy, but from his own countrymen. For a very brief moment, he considered explaining more. Then he stopped, not because he had nothing to say, but because he understood that in some moments, the more you speak, the more your honor is worn away. He chose silence not as surrender, but to preserve the last thing the war had never taken from him, his self-respect. That silence was not empty. It was filled with memory, filled with names that no longer appeared on any paperwork, filled with promises kept even when the cost was blood and time. And within that silence, he had no idea that everything was about to cross its final line. Because when a soldier chooses silence and is still pressed forward, what comes next is no longer a misunderstanding. It is public humiliation. The police officer stared at the medals on his chest for a long moment. It was not a look of recognition, but one of scrutiny, cold and rigid. Then he spoke, his voice not loud, yet clear enough for everyone nearby to hear. "These look too new. Where did you get them?" The question fell like a blade. It didn't need to be raised in anger to turn honor into suspicion. He drew a short breath. "Officer, those are my medals. Real medals." The second question came sharper than the first. Not to ask, but to deny. He didn't answer right away. Not because he didn't know how, but because he realized that truth in that moment was no longer what was being sought. He said only one sentence, very slowly, very clearly. I received them in the line of duty. The officer shook his head, a decisive shake as if every explanation had already lost its meaning. Kneel. Just 2 words. No reason added. No explanation required. In that instant, the space around them seemed to freeze. People pumping gas stopped mid-motion. A woman turned to look, her eyes wide. An older man stood motionless, lips pressed tight. No one spoke, but everyone understood that this had gone far beyond a routine check. He didn't react immediately. He didn't argue. He didn't ask why. Slowly, he lowered himself down. His knees touched the cold, unforgiving concrete. His uniform followed, meeting the ground. Not ordinary clothing. The same uniform he had worn during flag ceremonies. The same uniform he had worn while seeing comrades off for the last time. The medals on his chest were pressed against the pavement. Cold metal. Heavy. Not because of their weight, but because of what they represented. Each one was a story never fully told. A life or death decision. Someone who never came back. The officer stepped closer. Why are you impersonating a service member? His voice did not tremble. It was firm, as if the conclusion had already been made. He lifted his head slowly. I am not impersonating anyone. Just 4 words. No defense, no pleading. Silence. The command came faster than his reply. Around them, murmurs began to rise. Some people shook their heads. Others turned away, unable to bear what they were seeing. But no one stepped forward. No one intervened. He knelt there in broad daylight at a familiar gas station, as if everything he had ever done for this country had never existed. He felt every heartbeat slow, steady, heavy, not frantic like in combat, but weighed down all the same. He had knelt before in other moments, knelt to pull a comrade out of gunfire, knelt to bind wounds, knelt to whisper a final goodbye. But never had he knelt beneath the suspicious gaze of the very people he had once protected. The officer bent down, staring closely at the medals. Do you know impersonating these is a serious crime? He didn't answer, not because he was afraid, but because he understood that now every word could be twisted. His silence was no longer a choice, it was the last barrier preserving what little dignity he had left. A voice trembled from somewhere nearby. I've seen those medals before. The officer snapped around. Step away. That sentence slammed shut every remaining open door. From that moment on, this was no longer a matter between one Marine and one police officer. It had become a public humiliation witnessed, exposed, and impossible for anyone to pretend they hadn't seen. He lowered his head. Not out of shame, but because he could not bear to meet the eyes around him. Pity hurt more than suspicion ever could. A brief thought passed through his mind. Perhaps to some people a uniform was just fabric medals, or just metal, and honor was nothing more than an empty idea. And the moment his honor was pressed into the ground, before everyone, everything slipped beyond the boundary of a simple check into a chain of escalation that no one could control anymore. The dry clack of metal rang out as the handcuffs snapped shut. No further explanation was offered. No hesitation. His wrist jerked by reflex, then went still. He knew this sensation not because he had ever been arrested, but because he had cuffed prisoners himself in life-or-death situations. Never had he imagined he would be standing on this side on the very ground he had once sworn to protect. You are being detained for impersonating a service member. The words were delivered short and firm like a conclusion written long before it was spoken. He turned his head slowly. I am a United States Marine. No raised voice. No challenge. Just a fact stated the right way. Silence. The command cut him off, allowing nothing to exist but the authority standing in front of him. A man in the crowd stepped forward. I served. Those medals are real. He didn't finish the sentence before being shut down. Step back. This is not your business. Another woman spoke up, her voice trembling. He's just pumping gas. No one answered. No one even looked at her. The objection passed as if it had never existed. He felt the eyes around him. Not all were indifferent. Some were angry. Some were pained. But everyone stood still. And he understood. He had been in situations where standing still was the only way to survive. This time, though, standing still would not save his honor. The officer pulled him to his feet. The motion was quick and efficient, not rough, but enough to show that everything had crossed beyond a simple misunderstanding. The medals on his chest lightly struck the metal of the cuffs. A small sound, yet in his ears it rang like a belated apology to those who were no longer here. You have the right to remain silent. The familiar words were read in an even emotionless tone. He nodded, not because he didn't know his rights, but because he was long accustomed to following orders, even when those orders were carrying him away from everything he held dear. He was led away. Short, steady steps limited by the cuffs behind his back. He didn't look back, not out of shame, but because he didn't want to remember this moment through other people's eyes. He chose to remember it by the weight pressing in his chest. The door of the police car opened. He bent and stepped inside. Hard seat, tight space, the familiar smell of metal and plastic. The door closed behind him, separating him from the outside world, for a brief moment, long enough for him to realize he had just been pulled out of ordinary life. The car began to roll. He stared straight ahead. A number appeared clearly in his mind. A few dozen miles to home. A few dozen miles to see the familiar road. A few dozen miles to knock on the door and hear his mother call his name. In war, that distance was nothing. He had crossed longer stretches under fire. Now it had become unreachable. He thought of his mother. She was waiting. Maybe she had prepared a meal. Maybe she was watching the clock, wondering why he hadn't arrived yet. He had survived the worst places in the world, only to be stopped on the final stretch home. A question flashed through his mind, quick and sharp. What if he hadn't been wearing his uniform today? What if there were no medals on his chest? The question needed no answer. Its silence said everything. The car turned away from the gas station. Everything behind him began to fall away. He drew a deep breath, keeping it steady. This was no longer about one individual. He felt that clearly. When a soldier could be treated this way, the problem did not end with a mistaken stop. And as the wheels carried him farther from the scene where justice had fallen silent, a larger truth was quietly being awakened, waiting for the moment it would be seen. The door closed behind him, and in that brief moment, the noise outside disappeared. He stood there, hands still cuffed his back, straight from a habit etched deep into his body. He didn't look around. He didn't need to. He was used to rooms where decisions were made faster than explanations. Another officer entered. Not hurried, not loud. His eyes settled first on the uniform, not on skin color, not on the handcuffs, but on a uniform kept with care, as if the man wearing it had never allowed himself to be careless, not even once. The officer stepped closer. He examined the details, the insignia, the stitching, the placement of the medals. The silence lasted a few seconds, but it was no longer heavy. It carried focus, the kind that comes when someone who has known the battlefield recognizes signs only the experienced understand. Wait. The voice wasn't raised, but it was enough to change the air in the room. He lifted his head. Their eyes met for an instant. No challenge, just recognition. The officer looked directly at the medals on his chest and said slowly, "These are real, not praise, not a defense, just a truth spoken by its proper name." He didn't answer right away. His throat tightened not from emotion, but because for the first time since it began, he felt he was no longer invisible. Someone had seen him as a soldier, not as a suspicion. The officer turned to a colleague. "Do you know these medals?" Without waiting for an answer, he continued, "No one can fake them like this." The room fell quiet. A different kind of quiet without pressure carrying adjustment. Like the moment a mistake is finally acknowledged, even if no one has yet said the word sorry. The officer stepped closer. He drew out a key. The metal sounded softly as the handcuffs were unlocked. His wrists were freed, but he remained still. He didn't rush to rub them. He didn't shake them out, as if he needed an extra beat to believe this was truly happening. "I'm sorry." Two words spoken clearly without evasion. Not an apology for the entire system, but one from a person who understood that what had just happened was wrong. He nodded. Just a very small nod. Not to forgive immediately, but to acknowledge that the words had been heard. His papers were placed on the table. Military ID, deployment orders, unit information. Everything was correct. No argument needed. No explanation required. The cold text on the pages became in that moment more vivid proof than any spoken account. The officer reviewed each page carefully. "You just returned from the battlefield, yes?" A short answer. Enough. No one mentioned the gas station. No one spoke of kneeling. No one used the word mistake. But everyone understood that a boundary had been crossed, and now they were trying to step back. Someone else in the room said quietly, "You will verify this with your unit." He nodded again. He didn't object. He wasn't worried. Truth once seen doesn't need to hurry. In that moment, his honor wasn't fully restored, but it had been lifted off the ground. The medals on his chest were no longer viewed as suspicious objects, but as markers of a difficult journey. He stood there, hands free, back still straight. Not to prove anything, but because that was how he had been taught to exist. While everything around him was adjusting, he held the posture of someone accustomed to standing firm amid chaos. The truth had spoken, if only in brief sentences and knowing glances. And as it began to outweigh the noise, he didn't know it wouldn't stop within these walls. Because the instant his honor was recognized for the first time, a larger chain reaction quietly began reaching far beyond the room in which he stood. The phone was lifted, not out of protocol, but because there was no other way left to do what was right. "Give me his unit's number." The words were concise, stripped of emotion, yet clear enough for everyone in the room to understand that this situation had moved beyond local authority. The officer facing him turned and asked, "What unit are you with?" He answered briefly, the way he had answered. Hundreds of roll calls before unit name, rank, length of service. Not one word extra, not a single detail missing. The number was dialed. The phone rang once, then someone picked up. "We have one of your service members in custody." A very brief pause. Then the voice on the other end changed instantly. His name. His name was spoken, clear, precise. No one in the room said anything more. They waited. "I need to verify his file." "No need." The reply came faster than expected. "We know exactly who he is." The air in the room shifted, a short sentence carrying the weight of an entire system built on records, discipline, and collective memory. He just returned from the battlefield. "We know. He was handcuffed at a gas station." A longer silence followed. Then the voice on the other end slowed, deepened. "Who did this?" That question was not curiosity. It was accountability. The phone was passed to another hand. Another call began. Then another. His name was repeated. Not as a suspect, but as a file that needed protection. "Report this to command. Already reported. Escalate it to higher authority. Done." The calls continued in sequence, quiet, without display, yet each one lifted the matter to a higher level. From a small desk to a larger office. From a single unit to the full Marine Corps command. "We need all details of the incident." "Is there video? Are there witnesses? Why was he detained?" The questions came rapidly, not to accuse him, but to determine who had crossed the line. On the other end of the call, the voice turned firm. "This is no longer a local matter." That sentence drew a line. From that moment on, power no longer rested with a single individual at a gas station, but shifted to a system accountable to the nation. "We will report this to the Pentagon." No one objected. No one was surprised. His name was entered into an official report, not as a victim to be pitied, but as a service member who deserved proper treatment. Only a few hours later, another call came in. "The Department of Justice has been notified." The sentence was brief, yet enough to completely change the balance. He stood there listening as each piece of the unfolding chain reached him. He didn't ask questions. He didn't interrupt. He didn't demand anything. He was used to systems moving in their own way, and he understood that when a system begins to move, it doesn't require raised voices. Someone in the room turned to him, their tone entirely different from before. "Would you like to call your family?" He nodded. Just once. Not because he needed reassurance, but because he knew his mother was waiting. Meanwhile, the calls continued. The names of agencies that had never been part of his everyday life were spoken with gravity, not to create noise, but to acknowledge that something had gone wrong, and it could not be ignored. The Pentagon didn't ask whether he was a service member. They asked why one of theirs had been treated this way. The Department of Justice didn't ask what he had done wrong. They asked who had misused power. In that moment, he felt the shift clearly. Not through applause, not through public apologies, but through questions finally being asked in the right direction. He was no longer standing alone, no longer seen as an individual causing trouble. He was seen as part of something larger, where honor is not something that can be pressed into the ground and dismissed. He exhaled slowly, not relieved, but steadier. The truth had not only been seen, it had been turned into action. And when real authority finally appeared, The question was no longer what had happened, but who would be held responsible for what had been done. The federal trial unfolded under strict order. No noise, no theatrics. Only the truth laid out on the table piece by piece, the way justice operates when there is no room left for personal emotion. The prosecutor opened the file. This was not an isolated mistake. The thick dossier was turned page by page. The officer's name appeared again and again across different reports following the same pattern. Traffic stops without cause. Unnecessary searches. Black citizens detained with no clear charges. 4 prior complaints. Same targets. Same behavior. No disciplinary action. The defense attorney stood. My client followed procedure. The familiar line echoed through the room, but this time it carried no weight. The prosecutor answered immediately. What procedure allows an officer to handcuff a service member wearing a military uniform and medals? There was no response. The screen lit up. The video was played. Uncut. Unedited. The Marine stood still, answered politely. No threatening gestures. No resistance. Commands were given. Hands up. Kneel. Handcuffs. The images were so clear they needed no commentary. The courtroom fell silent. A witness was called. I said the medals were real. Another followed. I'm a veteran. I recognized them immediately. Short statements. No excess emotion. Yet each one carved deeper into the void left by abused authority. The prosecutor concluded this was not a misunderstanding. This was a choice. A choice to suspect. A choice to ignore evidence. A choice to misuse power. Then it was his turn to stand. Not as a defendant, but as someone who had lived through the consequences. He did not raise his voice. He did not accuse. He simply spoke what he had experienced. I have been afraid of death. Every mission I knew I might not come back. But on the battlefield, I knew who the enemy was. He paused. At that gas station, I didn't know what I had done wrong. And that feeling was more frightening. The room went still. I've lost friends. I've seen things that should never exist. But never have I felt my dignity stripped away like I did that day on my own soil. There were no tears, no trembling. Only truth spoken in the steady voice of someone long accustomed to staying calm amid chaos. He ended with a single short statement. I am not here for revenge. I am here so this doesn't happen to someone else. The jury did not deliberate long. The evidence was overwhelming. The pattern undeniable. The judge stood, his voice slow, clear. You did not see a human being. You did not see a service member. You saw only what you wanted to see. The sentence was read. 62 years in federal prison. There was no cheering, no sense of triumph. He sat quietly, not happy, not bitter. This was not his victory. It was the cost of wielding power without responsibility. After the trial, he was asked how he felt. He answered with a single sentence, I hope no one ever has to go through this again. His dignity did not come from the sentence. It came from refusing to let pain turn him into someone else. He did not seek revenge. He let the truth do its work. And when justice had spoken, what remained was not punishment, but the question of what society would do with a lesson paid for at such a devastating price. After the trial, everything did not end with the sentence. The soldier's name no longer appeared as that of a victim, but became the starting point for concrete change. A new law was passed, brief but unmistakably clear, requiring law enforcement agencies to verify military status before using coercive force. Not as a privilege, but out of respect for the honor of those entrusted by the nation with the authority to bear arms in defense of others. The video from the gas station did not fade with time. It was archived, placed into training curricula, replayed during instruction sessions for a single purpose, to remind that power must never stand above human dignity. New officers watched it not to judge the past, but to understand the line they must never cross. The soldier returned to ordinary life. No grand welcome. No speeches. He drove home, opened the door, stepped into a familiar room. His mother held him tightly longer than usual, as if she needed to be certain he had truly come back. He didn't say much. He only told her he was fine, and for her that was enough. His honor was restored in paperwork and law and in public words. But the wound was not on any record. It lived in memory, in the feeling of being pressed to the ground under the gaze of strangers. in the moment of realizing that a uniform is not always enough to shield the one who wears it from suspicion. He kept living. He went to work. He met friends. From time to time, he touched the medals carefully stored away. Not to relive heroics, but to remember that he had not broken when treated unjustly. He did not become a symbol. He did not want to be one. He only wanted to be a soldier who had completed his duty and a citizen treated fairly. Some nights he still woke up, not to gunfire, but to questions without full answers. What if there had been no video that day? What if there were no witnesses? What if there had been no intervention from the highest levels? How many similar stories had passed in silence? The legacy of this story is not found in the number of years in a sentence. It lies in a system forced to look at itself, in difficult conversations finally beginning. In younger members of the military and law enforcement, learning that respect is not a choice, it is an obligation. The soldier was asked whether he regretted speaking up. He answered simply, "If I had stayed silent, the next person would have suffered this." There was no anger in his words. Only responsibility, the same responsibility he had carried throughout his life in uniform. The story does not close with victory, but with a question posed to society as a whole. What will America do to ensure that those once ready to sacrifice everything for the flag do not lose their dignity when they come home? Will we act only when evidence is undeniable, or will we act before honor is trampled again? He continues down his path quietly, asking for no attention. Yet the mark he leaves is no longer silent. It exists in new laws, in training manuals, and in the awareness of those who have seen this story and can no longer look away. Brave veteran stories. We remember the quiet heroes. If this story makes you believe that honor and kindness never retire, please, share this video and subscribe to Brave Veteran Stories so that none of their memories are ever forgotten.